There's a number that got burned into my memory the day I stopped being afraid of the universe. 8. Not 8 years, not 8 battles, not 8 light years between us and the nearest Veth warship. 8 seconds. That's all it took. 8 seconds of something so raw, so completely and utterly human that 300 Veth soldiers, creatures that had crushed 47 civilizations before breakfast, stood completely still. Didn't fire. Didn't advance. Didn't even breathe in whatever way their biology managed breathing. They just stopped. And that pause, that 8-second window of alien terror, is the reason I'm still alive to write this down. Let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you all of it, because most people only heard the headline. Most people only saw the grainy transmission footage that made it back through the relay stations. They saw the moment. They didn't see what led to it. They didn't see Corporal Des Heron standing alone in that corridor with a broken suit and a cracked visor, and a smile on his face that had no business being there. Chapter 1, Station Anvil 7, 3 days before. The first thing you need to understand about Station Anvil 7 is that nobody wanted to be there. It wasn't a punishment posting, not technically. The brass called it a strategic forward observation installation in all the official documentation, which is military language for we built something in the worst possible location and now someone has to staff it. It sat at the rough edge of the Helios belt, which is a cluster of rocks and dead moons so far out from the warm center of the system that the sun looked like a slightly brighter star from our windows. Cold, dark, loud with the constant static of cosmic interference that played hell with our communications. We had 63 personnel on that station. 63 humans, 6 months into a 12-month rotation, trying to monitor Veth movement along the outer shipping lanes and relay intelligence back to Fleet Command on New Carthage. I want you to picture what that does to a person. 6 months of monitoring. 6 months of watching sensor data and writing reports and heating reconstituted meal packs in the galley microwave that made a sound like a dying animal every time the door opened. 6 months of the same 62 faces in the same corridors under the same recycled air that always smelled faintly of machine oil and someone's synthetic coffee. We weren't warriors anymore. Not really, we were watchers. Which meant that when the Veth actually came, we weren't ready. Not emotionally, not psychologically. We knew the protocols. We drilled them. But protocols are paper and drills are theater, and when 300 Veth drop soldiers materialize in your docking ring at 3:47 station time, something happens in your chest that no amount of training fully prepares you for. I remember the alarm. That specific tone, 2 long pulses, 1 short, repeating, that Station Anvil used for a hull breach or unauthorized boarding. I remember hearing it in my bunk and sitting up and thinking for exactly 1 second that it was another drill. Just 1 second. Then I heard Hendricks screaming in the corridor. Not screaming in pain, screaming orders. Corporal Lena Hendricks, 26 years old from Cape Verde, who spent her off hours teaching herself to play a small stringed instrument she'd brought from home, and who cried at the end of every single movie we watched in the rec room without exception. She was out there in the corridor screaming orders like someone had poured 20 years of combat experience into her overnight. That's when I knew it was real. I pulled on my suit in the dark. The station's emergency lighting had kicked in, painting everything red, and I could feel the vibration through the floor that meant the docking ring had been breached. Not explosively, the Veth don't always blow things open, not when they want to take a station intact. Sometimes they're surgical. A precise cut through the airlock sealing mechanism, a compressed override of the docking protocols, and suddenly your door just opens from the outside. I grabbed my rifle from the locker beside my bunk. The rifle was standard issue, a UHEDF pattern kinetic carbine, which is a fancy way of saying it fires dense metal at high velocity, and it's been the backbone of human infantry since we first started running into species that didn't want to share the neighborhood. Good weapon. Reliable. I'd fired it 1,000 times in training and 3 times in actual combat, all of them in the Kepler skirmishes 2 years prior. I held it now, and my hands were shaking. Not from fear or not entirely from fear. The station temperature had dropped. When a structure loses pressure integrity in space, even partially, the cold gets in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in thin fingers of it that find your skin and remind you exactly where you are. 60 million kilometers from anything warm. Alone in the dark. I stepped into the corridor. There were 4 people ahead of me already moving toward the docking ring. Hendricks, Sergeant Yoon, Private Castillo, and a technician named Reyes who'd grabbed a sidearm from somewhere and looked like he deeply regretted every life choice that had led him to this moment. Behind me, I could hear more boots, more voices, the specific kind of organized chaos that a military unit generates when it shifts from sleeping to fighting in under 3 minutes. I caught up with Yoon. "How many?" I asked. He looked at me. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen on him before. He'd been in the service longer than most of us combined. He'd fought the Keth incursion at Proxima Station. He'd done things that got quietly classified and never discussed at dinner. He said a lot. That was all. Chapter 2, the first sight of them. I'd seen Veth before. In briefings, in classified imagery, in the grainy combat footage that occasionally made it back through the relay networks from the front lines farther out. I thought I knew what they looked like. Knowing what something looks like and seeing it standing in front of you are 2 completely different experiences. The Veth are tall. I want to say 7 feet, but some of them are closer to 8, and the way their bodies are proportioned, longer limbs than seems physically efficient, a torso that's deeper front to back than it is wide, heads that sit low on thick necks with no visible join, makes them look wrong in a way that goes past mere unfamiliarity. They look like someone described a human being over a bad connection, and the listener got most of it right, but not quite all of it. Their armor is biological. That's the thing that still bothers me most, even now. It's not metal or composite, it's grown. Organic plating that's technically part of their bodies, dark greenish-black and textured like something between bark and chitin. It absorbs light differently depending on the angle, which means in the red emergency lighting of Station Anvil's corridors, they seemed to shift and ripple as they moved, like shadows that had decided to become solid. They moved without sound. That was the other thing. 300 of them, and they moved without sound. No footfalls or nothing loud enough to carry over the station's ambient noise. Just presence. Mask the sense of something large occupying space that used to be yours. The first group of them were already through the docking ring and into the main corridor hub when we got there. I counted 12 in that first cluster. 12 Veth soldiers, weapons raised. Their weapons look like long, articulated bones that they hold with both primary and secondary limbs, and they pulse with a dim blue-green light when charged, spreading out into the hub with the practiced efficiency of a species that has done this before, many times, on many stations belonging to many civilizations. They saw us. We saw them. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, nothing happened. Then Private Castillo said very quietly, "Oh no." And it started. Chapter 3, the first hour. The first hour of the Anvil 7 boarding was not heroic. I want to be honest about that. The stories that came out afterward, some of them made it sound like we were magnificent from the first moment. Disciplined and brave and ready. That's not what it was. What it was terrifying and loud and full of the specific kind of confusion that comes when trained soldiers run into a situation that is larger and faster than any training accounted for. We fell back. That's the honest truth. We fell back from the hub, taking casualties in those first minutes, not deaths in that first push, but injuries. Reyes caught a Veth pulse blast on his left arm that melted through his suit and left burns that would keep him in the medical bay for a week. Corporal Shin took a hit to the leg. 3 others were clipped in varying degrees of severity. We fell back to the secondary corridor network. The inner ring of Station Anvil was constructed in a kind of wheel-and-spoke arrangement, with the hub at the center and 4 main corridors extending outward like compass points, each ending in a section, maintenance, residential quarters, command and communications, and the power generation plant. Between those main spokes, there was a network of narrower service corridors that ran in arcs connecting them. Those service corridors were our salvation. The Veth are larger than humans, significantly. Their bulk, which works in their favor in open combat, and in the kind of wide shipboard corridors designed for human-sized beings, becomes a liability when you try to move a 7 to 8 foot soldier through a maintenance tunnel built for a maintenance drone, and whatever human technician needs to crawl in after it. We knew the station, they didn't. That matters. It matters enormously, actually, and I don't think the Veth anticipated it. They'd clearly done reconnaissance. They knew the main layout, the hub, the spoke corridors, the location of our command center. But they didn't know the service tunnels the way we did. Didn't know which junction connected to which section. Didn't know that there was a gap behind the water recycling unit in section. See that a person could slip through and come out 3 levels below in the power plant access. Sergeant Yoon started using that knowledge within 20 minutes of the first contact. Yoon was extraordinary in those hours. I want to say that clearly. He was the kind of person who becomes more himself under pressure, not less. Some people collapse inward when the situation gets bad, they freeze, or they get loud and erratic, or they lock onto one decision and can't release it even when it stops working. Yoon was the opposite. The worse things got, the quieter he became, the more specific and deliberate. He gathered the 12 of us who'd made it back to the service corridor network, and he crouched in the narrow space with his back against a pipe, and his eyes moving while he talked, and he laid out what we were going to do. Not survive, not wait for rescue. Those things were on the agenda, but they weren't the frame. The frame was fight, hold, make the station so costly to take that the Veth couldn't afford to stay in it long enough to do what they'd come to do. We don't win by killing them, Yoon said. His voice in the dark corridor was low and even. We can't kill enough of them. There are 300 of them and 12 of us, and our weapons aren't designed for punching through Veth bioarmor at close range, so we don't fight them that way. How do we fight them? Hendricks asked. Yoon looked at her. We make the station fight them. What followed was 3.5 days of something that the after-action reports would eventually classify as asymmetric defensive operations, and that Yoon himself, when asked about it later, described as making a general nuisance of ourselves. They turned off the gravity in the maintenance section and watched a Veth squad lose all effectiveness when their heavily armored bodies became projectiles in a zero-G environment, crashing into walls and each other with spectacular incompetence while our team, trained in zero-G maneuvering, navigated around them. They rerouted the station's climate control to push superheated air into the hub in 45-minute intervals, which didn't injure the Veth, but made them deeply uncomfortable and disrupted their communication equipment, which apparently operated on a frequency sensitive to thermal interference. They rigged the lighting system to cycle between the red emergency mode and complete darkness in irregular patterns, because their intelligence profiles on Veth biology suggested that the species had evolved in a relatively stable light environment and was less adaptable to rapid luminosity change than humans. They used the service tunnels to appear and disappear, strike and withdraw, make noise in places the Veth couldn't predict, and be somewhere else when the response came. It was not comfortable. It was exhausting. People got hurt in ways that the medical bay, now inaccessible, held by the Veth, couldn't properly treat. Castillo was running a fever by day 2 from the wound in his leg that was getting infected without proper care. Shin had improvised a splint for what turned out to be a hairline fracture in her right knee. Everyone was operating on catnaps and stim patches, and the kind of determined, almost irrational stubbornness that seems to be a specifically human trait. The Veth, from what we could observe on the few functioning internal sensors we still had access to, were frustrated. Not frightened, not yet. That part was coming, but first Des Heron. Chapter 4, The Corporal. I have to tell you about Des Heron because he's the center of this. He's the reason the story is called what it's called. He's the reason I'm writing this down instead of being processed through whatever happens to captured human military personnel at a Veth holding installation. Des Heron was 24 years old. He was from a small agricultural settlement on the second ring of New Meridian, one of those places where most young people either stay and farm or leave and join something, because there aren't many options in between. He joined the UHEDF at 18, which is the minimum entry age, and by the time he ended up at Anvil 7, he'd been in for 6 years, which is long enough to be experienced but not long enough to be jaded. He was not remarkable on paper. Good scores, solid evaluations, no particular distinctions. He was the kind of soldier that large military organizations depend on and rarely celebrate competent, reliable, steady under ordinary pressure. He did his job. He didn't make speeches. He had a habit of humming very quietly to himself when he was concentrating on something, which drove certain people in the unit crazy and which others found oddly comforting. He was also, in my observation, the kind of person who had made some deep private peace with certain things that most people spend their whole lives avoiding thinking about. He wasn't reckless. He didn't have a death wish. wasn't performing bravery for anyone's approval. But there was something in him that had settled, that had arrived at an internal stillness that doesn't come from certainty about outcomes, but from certainty about self. He knew what he was, he knew what he'd do when it came to it. I think that was what the Veth couldn't process, in the end. By the third day, the situation had degraded significantly. The Veth had adapted, partly. They'd figured out some of the service tunnel network, not all of it, but enough to close off our most reliable routes between sections. They'd established control of the hub, the command center, and the docking ring. They'd set up what our sensors identified as a signal jamming installation in the communications section, which was why the relay stations hadn't heard from us, and why Fleet Command had no idea what was happening at Anvil 7. That signal jammer was the problem. That was the thing that had to go down. If we couldn't get a distress signal out, rescue wasn't coming. Not in any time frame that mattered. The next scheduled contact with our relay was 8 days out. In 8 days, with our 12 people getting progressively less functional and the Veth getting progressively more entrenched, the station was going to fall. Completely and permanently. The jammer was in the communications section, which is the spoke at the northern compass point of the station's wheel. To get there from where we were, holed up in the maintenance section's deeper tunnels, we had to cross the hub. The hub that had 40-plus Veth soldiers in it at any given time. There was a service route, a narrow one running through the ventilation infrastructure that connected maintenance to communications via the outer rim of the hub rather than through the center. But it had a problem, a 30-meter exposed stretch of corridor that ran along the hub's outer wall, visible from inside through a series of heavy glass panels. The kind of transparent section that had been architecturally fashionable when the station was built, designed to give the hub a sense of openness and visibility. 30 meters of open corridor, visible from inside where 40 Veth soldiers were standing. To get to that corridor, a person would have to drop from the ventilation shaft through an access panel, then cross the 30 meters, then re-enter the ventilation system at the other end. In open view, the plan, if you could call it that, if plans can be things that make everyone who hears them go very quiet, was to create a distraction in the residential quarters section, on the far side of the hub, that would draw the Veth's attention, and then have someone cross that corridor while their attention was elsewhere. The distraction would have to be significant, loud, alarming enough to pull a substantial number of those soldiers away from their positions. Yoon explained the plan. Then he asked for volunteers for the distraction team because it was the more dangerous role. Des Heron's hand went up immediately. So did several others, which was not surprising because that's the kind of unit Anvil 7's crew was, even after everything. But Yoon picked Heron and Hendricks and Castillo, who absolutely should not have been moving on that infected leg, but who looked at Yoon and said clearly and quietly, "I'm going." And that was that. I was assigned to the crossing. My job was to get to the communications section, get the jammer down, and get a signal out. Simple. Chapter 5, The Distraction. What Heron and his small team did in the residential quarters on the morning of the 4th day is, technically, the subject of a separate operational record that I've contributed to and that exists in the UHEDF's classified archives. I'm not going to detail all of it. But I need to tell you the shape of it, because it connects to what came later. They used the residential quarters emergency systems, specifically the automated fire suppression infrastructure, which on station Anvil 7 was a pressurized release system using a dense particulate compound that smothered oxygen from a fire without being actively harmful to biological organisms. In other words, a non-toxic explosion of dense white chemical particulate that filled a space completely and effectively blinded everything in it for several minutes. They triggered that. They also triggered the emergency pressure equalization valves in 3 of the residential bays simultaneously, which created a sound that was, and several of the Veth communications intercepts we analyzed afterward confirmed this, deeply alarming to Veth auditory organs. Something about the frequency. It landed in a range that triggered an instinctive alert response in Veth biology, the equivalent of a very loud, very specific kind of alarm bell that evolution had wired them to respond to urgently. And then, and this is the part I wasn't told about in advance, the part Heron apparently decided on his own in the moment. He opened his helmet communicator to the station-wide channel and started talking. Not reporting, not giving orders. Talking, he said in a conversational tone. Hey, Veth, you know what your problem is? You've been doing this for so long you forgot that not everyone stays scared. Come find me if you want to have a conversation about it. And then he gave his actual location, in the residential section. I heard it through my earpiece, crouched in the ventilation shaft above the hub, preparing to drop into the corridor. And I remember thinking two things simultaneously. First, that is either the bravest thing I have ever heard or the most insane. And second, it's working. Because the Veth response was immediate and overwhelming. Almost every soldier in that hub turned toward the residential corridor. Weapons up, communicators blazing with their own signals. Our intercepts couldn't translate Veth language in real time, but we could read the urgency in the burst patterns, moving with sudden, focused purpose toward the residential section. Away from the transparent panels. Away from the 30 meters of corridor I needed to cross. I dropped from the vent. I want to tell you what it felt like to run those 30 meters. The floor under my boots was cold, station metal, losing heat. The lighting was still on that erratic cycle Yoon had set up, which meant it flickered as I ran, turning the corridor into a stroboscopic nightmare of light and dark. Through the glass panels on my left, I could see the hub, still not empty, never fully empty. There were always some Veth staying put, and I could see that 3 of them had not moved with the main group. 3 of them were still stationed at the far side of the hub, facing roughly in my direction. I ran low. I ran as fast as I could, which in a damaged suit with a cracked visor seal that was slowly leaking warmth into the corridor was not exactly peak performance. My boots on the metal made noise, but the flickering lights and the distant sound of chaos from the residential section and the pressure valve alarm Heron had set off were all competing for auditory space. 20 meters. I saw one of the Veth turn. Not toward me. Slightly toward me, a partial movement of that low, heavy head. Not a full turn. Not direct eye contact or whatever their visual organs constituted. 15 meters. It turned further. 10. I hit the vent access panel at the far end of the corridor with my shoulder, hard enough that I felt it in my whole arm, and the panel gave. It was designed to in emergencies, and I was inside the shaft and moving before the turn became a full recognition. I lay in the shaft for 30 seconds, not breathing, listening. Nothing came. I kept moving. The communications section was dark when I got there. The Veth had shut down the non-essential power systems in sections they weren't occupying, which meant I was working in near-total blackness with only the helmet light, running on its own battery, separate from the main suit power, to see by. The jammer was easy to find. It's not hard to find a piece of equipment that isn't supposed to be there in a room you know well. It was installed against the primary communications array, physically interfaced with our relay transmission system, a Veth device that looked everything they make looks biological, like a cluster of thick, dark tendrils wrapped around our equipment. Organic and technological simultaneously, in the unsettling way Veth engineering always manages. I knew how to disable it in theory. Yoon had briefed us. The theoretical process took about 7 minutes if you knew what you were doing, slightly less if you'd done it before. And I hadn't done it before, but I'd studied the procedure enough times to have it essentially memorized. I was halfway through the 3rd step when I heard, through my earpiece, Heron's voice again. Different this time. Akaffer, that was my name. My name, specifically on the private channel between him and me, not the team channel, the 2-person channel we'd set up on day 2 for direct communication. How's it going over there? I said 4 minutes, maybe 3, what's happening with you? He was quiet for a second. Then he said, company. The 3 I didn't draw over from the hub found a route around. I've got 3 Veth in the corridor, outside the residential bay. I stopped moving. Are you contained? For now, a pause. The residential section has a problem, though. They're going to figure out pretty quickly that it doesn't connect back to the main tunnel network from here. Once they do that, there's only one way for me to go. The main hub corridor, I said. Yeah. Straight through the hub. 40-plus Veth soldiers, now presumably returning from whatever they'd found or not found in the residential section. Back to their positions, back to the hub. Des, I said. Finish your job, he said. I'll figure something out. Chapter 6, The 8 Seconds. I finished the job. I need to say that first, because what happened next might sound like I abandoned him. And I didn't. I finished in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, which was faster than the theoretical minimum, because my hands were shaking and I was not entirely focused on what I was doing, which perversely meant I stopped second-guessing every connection and just did it. The jammer went dark. I triggered the emergency relay on the communications array, a simple burst transmission, pre-written with our station identifier, our status, our coordinates, and a single phrase. Active hostile boarding. Station compromised. Require immediate assistance. Then I opened the team channel. Signals out, I said. Yoon said, good. Now get to the service tunnel junction at C4 and hold until. Heron's voice cut across both of ours. Not panicked. That's the thing I keep coming back to every time I replay this in my memory. He didn't sound panicked. He sounded the way he always sounded, quiet, focused, with that underneath quality of someone who has made peace with something. He said, I need everyone to listen. I'm in the main hub corridor. I'm alone. I don't have a working suit seal, and I've got 3 Veth behind me and approximately 40 in front of me, and I need about 4 minutes for the extraction route to be viable. Silence on the channel. Then Yoon said, very carefully, what are you going to do for 4 minutes, Corporal? And Des said, I'm going to talk to them. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too, in the half-second before he started, that this was a person having their last moment of delusion. That fear had rotated something in him, and what came out the other end was a breakdown dressed up as a plan. I was wrong. He stepped out into the hub corridor, alone. In a damaged suit, visor cracked, one arm of the suit where a pulse blast had clipped him 12 hours earlier, showing the dark metallic underlayer through the outer shell. He stepped out into that corridor and he faced approximately 40 Veth soldiers. And they stopped. Now here is the thing, and I have read every piece of analysis that came out of this incident afterward, the xenopsychology reports, the military intelligence assessments, the behavioral science papers. The stopping was not immediate surprise. The Veth had seen human soldiers before. They'd been boarding human installations for 2 years at that point. They knew what we looked like. But they had never, apparently, encountered this. One human being, damaged suit, no apparent tactical advantage, stepping into a corridor full of 300 soldiers without cover, without backup, without any of the things that military logic said you needed to justify forward movement. The Veth tactical literature, and yes, they have tactical literature, it's been partially translated, describes a concept that their xenologists approximate in human language as something like calculated aggression probability. It's essentially what a Veth soldier uses to rapidly assess a threat. Is this entity moving toward us because it has calculated that forward movement improves its survival odds, or for some other reason? A human soldier with backup and a plan that justified forward movement was a known quantity. They knew how to read that. A human soldier alone, damaged, no backup, stepping forward, that broke the model. Their tactical assessment systems, trained on 2 years of human encounters, could not generate a calculated aggression probability that explained what they were seeing, because no calculation made sense. The human could not have reasonably calculated that this improved its odds. Therefore, it was doing something that wasn't based on survival calculation. And a being that isn't acting based on survival calculation is, in any military context, deeply, profoundly unpredictable. Unpredictable things are dangerous. They stopped. Des Heron stood in that hub corridor, between 3 Veth behind him and 40 in front of him, and for 8 seconds no one moved. 8 seconds. He told me later, much later, in a medical facility on New Carthage, where he was being treated for the suit seal failure and the secondary burns, and a number of other things the doctors cataloged with slightly horrified thoroughness, that he didn't have a plan for those 8 seconds. He'd bought the time, but he hadn't scripted what to do with it. So he did the only thing that felt true. He smiled. Not a combat grimace, not a threat display, a genuine, quiet smile. The kind of smile a person gives when they've decided something, when the internal argument is over and the decision is made and there's a kind of peace in it. He told me it wasn't performed. He wasn't trying to unsettle them, not consciously. He was just done being afraid. And somehow, across whatever xenological gap exists between human facial musculature and Veth pattern recognition, the 40-plus soldiers in that corridor processed that expression and found it more alarming than anything else they'd encountered. A human being facing impossible odds smiling. Not because the odds were good. Not because there was a plan. Because it simply didn't matter to him the way survival logic said it should. That smile broke something in their formation, fractured the collective assessment. The front line of Veth soldiers, the ones closest to him, stepped back. Not many steps. 2, maybe 3, but backward, away from the single damaged human standing alone in the corridor. And in that moment, Heron started walking toward them. Not running, not charging. Walking. 1 step, 2, 3. Slow and steady, that smile on his face, his damaged suit leaking warmth into the recycled air of the hub corridor. The Veth did not fire. They could have, they absolutely could have. 40 soldiers, weapons charged, 3 seconds would have been more than sufficient. They did not fire. They did not fire because for those 8 seconds, and then the seconds that followed them, the 3 minutes and 52 seconds it took for Yoon's extraction team to reach Heron's position from the C4 junction. No one in that formation had a clean tactical read on what they were dealing with. They'd fought humans before, brave humans, desperate humans. Humans who made final stands and went down fighting and died the way soldiers die everywhere, with courage and with grief, and with the specific dignity of those who chose something larger than themselves. But a human who walked toward 300 soldiers and smiled like the universe owed him nothing, like fear, was a thing that had been settled in some private negotiation long before this moment. That was not in any of their models. They hesitated. Humans die by seconds, and humans survive by them too. Those 8 seconds were enough. Chapter 7, The Extraction. Yoon's team hit the hub corridor from 2 service tunnel access points simultaneously, East Spoke and the Outer Rim vent system, while the Veth were still processing what they were looking at. 4 people coming out of unexpected access points, while the entire forward element of the Veth force had its collective attention on one unarmed, smiling corporal in a broken suit. Yoon himself got to Heron, grabbed him by the damaged suit's shoulder and pulled him sideways into the service corridor mouth that had been opened from the inside by Hendricks. The Veth responded. Of course they did. The moment Yoon touched Heron, the model broke and the combat logic reasserted itself, and weapons came up across that whole formation. But the moment passed faster than they could act on it. Because they'd spent 8 seconds not acting. And 8 seconds in close quarters, rapidly evolving tactical situations is not nothing. It's the difference between the moment of advantage and the moment that's already gone. We were in the corridors before the first Veth pulse blast hit the wall where Heron had been standing. We ran. The running took another 40 minutes. There were 3 more close contacts in the service tunnel network, 2 of which involved brief exchanges of fire in spaces barely wide enough to stand sideways. Reyes, who absolutely should not have been combat active with a burned arm, but who was never going to stay in a safe position while others were fighting, took another hit, this one to the shoulder of the already damaged arm, which would eventually cost him full use of it, a fact he absorbed with a quietness that still makes me emotional to think about. We got to the outer maintenance bay, which was our hold position, the place we'd identified on day 1 as our best defensible deep retreat if things went sideways, as far from the hub as the station architecture allowed, with limited access points and the advantage of terrain we knew intimately. We sealed every entrance we could seal. We sat in the dark. We waited. Chapter 8, The Wait. Rescue came in 11 hours. Not 8 days, not the scheduled relay contact. 11 hours from the time I sent that distress signal, a UHEDF rapid response carrier dropped out of transit at the edge of the Helios belt and began its approach. 11 hours later, the first human military boots from outside hit the Anvil 7 docking ring. I found out later that the carrier, the UES Resolute, a name that seemed impossibly appropriate given the circumstances, had already been in transit toward this region on a different assignment when my signal hit the relay network and got bounced to Fleet Command. The proximity was luck. The decision to redirect was not. That was a human in a command chair on the Resolute reading the words, active hostile boarding, and making a call in under 2 minutes. When the Resolute crew hit the station, the Veth were already withdrawing. Partly because the extraction signal had been detected, their intelligence systems apparently identified a rapid response transit signature before we could. Partly because the jammer going down had disrupted their broader operational timeline. But partly, and this was the part the Resolute's intelligence officer told us about carefully in the debrief, because of what had happened in the hub corridor. The Veth operational communications in the hours following Harren's walk had included a specific and apparently agitated reference to the incident. Not in words that translated cleanly. Veth language has registers that don't have direct human equivalents. But the closest translation the intelligence systems could generate was something like a type of human that does not respond to survival parameters in the expected way. It had been flagged, sent up their command chain. There was apparently some discussion. The Resolute's intelligence officer said she found that extremely interesting. Chapter 9, Aftermath. The debrief took 4 days. Not because we weren't cooperating, we cooperated completely, answered every question, gave every detail of those 4 days that we could remember. It took 4 days because there were a lot of questions, and because the people asking them kept stopping and asking follow-up questions about specific moments that they found, I think, difficult to process. Particularly the 8 seconds. The xenopsychology team from Fleet Command's Research Division was especially interested. They interviewed Harren for 6 hours across 2 sessions. I wasn't in the room for those, but I talked to him after each one, and he gave me the broad shape of what they'd discussed. They wanted to know if he'd calculated it. If there had been, on some level, a rational plan underneath the apparent irrationality. If the smile had been deliberate. If the walk had been tactical. Harren thought about these questions. He was honest about the thinking he'd done, the internal process that led to that moment. He told them, I knew I probably wasn't going to make it out of that corridor. That was pretty clear from the math. And I just decided at some point in the service tunnels, maybe a day before it happened, that if I was going to go down in that hub, I was going to go down being exactly what I am. Not performing something. Not being something I'm not for the sake of the last few seconds. Just being the most me I could be. The xenopsychologists apparently found this extremely significant. The way they explained it from an alien psychology standpoint was that virtually every species they'd cataloged had survival logic as a baseline operating principle. Even species that practiced sacrifice, and they existed, several cataloged species would sacrifice individuals for the collective, did so through a framework that could be modeled as collective survival calculation. The individual died so the group lived, and in that sense the survival logic was preserved at the group level. What Harren had done was something different. He hadn't calculated collective survival. He hadn't made a rational trade. He'd simply opted out of the survival calculation framework entirely. He'd been willing to die not because it served a purpose, but because he'd made peace with the possibility, and that peace had freed him to be fully present in the moment, to act without the weight of survival anxiety distorting every decision. And the Veth, who had been making survival calculation reads on human beings for 2 years, had no model for it. They'd seen humans sacrifice themselves. They had a model for that. They didn't have a model for a human who looked like he'd simply finished being afraid. The casualty numbers for Anvil 7, officially, no deaths. 11 injuries of varying severity, of which Raises was the most significant and permanent. The Veth operational losses were not publicly disclosed, but the intelligence assessments put their dead and wounded from our 4 days of asymmetric harassment at somewhere between 18 and 27, which against the backdrop of 300 soldiers sounds modest, until you consider the resources it cost them and the operational timeline it disrupted. The jammer went down, the signal went out, help came. 63 humans walked off that station, all of them, when the Resolute evacuated us for assessment and medical treatment. The Veth left nothing behind but the marks on the walls and that organic jammer device, still wrapped around our communications array, its tendrils already beginning to dry and detach without the biological signals from its host system to keep it alive. Chapter 10, What Got Told. Here's the thing about stories, what gets told and what doesn't. The official account of Anvil 7 was thorough and fair. It credited Yoon's operational leadership. It noted the contributions of Hendricks, Castillo, Reyes, Shin, and everyone else. It recorded Harron's actions accurately. The UHEDF gave out commendations, which are quiet things, pieces of metal that sit in cases on mantelpieces and mean the world to the people who earned them and not much to anyone else. But stories escape official accounts. Stories escape official accounts because people talk. People who were there, people who worked on the Resolute, people in Fleet Command's Intelligence Division, people in the Xenopsychology Research Group. They talk to other people who talk to other people, and the story moves through the networks that human beings have always used to carry the things that matter to them. The story that moved through those networks was not about the asymmetric tactics, not about the signal jammer, not about the 11 injuries and the 63 survivors and the commendations. The story that moved through those networks was about a single moment in a hub corridor, a damaged suit, a quiet smile, a man walking toward 300 soldiers like he'd already made his peace with whatever came next. It moved fast. It moved through the UHEDF postings and the fleet channels and the civilian information networks and the coded messages that human communities throughout the settled systems used to share the things that mattered. And as it moved, it picked up weight, the way stories do, the way true things gain mass as they travel. And eventually, and this was the part that made the xenopsychology team very, very interested, it started moving in directions that weren't human networks. The Veth had informants among neutral species. They had intelligence channels, and something at some point in the months that followed Anvil 7 made it back to them. Not the tactical details, they already had those from their own operational records. Something else. The story. The human version of the story. The version where Des Harron became not a tactical anomaly but a symbol, an example of something. A name attached to a moment that other humans were using to say, this is what we are. This is what we're capable of. This is what you didn't expect. It changed something. Not everything. The Veth did not suddenly become gentle. The conflict didn't end. Human settlements were still at risk, still needed defending, still faced the specific ongoing horror of a species larger and older and better armed than us that had decided to expand into space we were also using. But the calculus shifted. Chapter 11, the Xenopsychology Report. I've read the classified version of the Xenopsychology Report that came out of the Anvil 7 analysis. All 87 pages of it, which took most of a morning and left me slightly dazed. The researchers had a specific term for what they identified in the 8-second incident. They called it non-parametric action display, which is a very academic way of saying doing something that doesn't fit any predictive model. The argument they made, carefully, with significant qualifications in the way scientific papers do, was that the Veth's extraordinary effectiveness against other civilizations had been built on a foundation of predictive modeling. They were extraordinarily good at figuring out what a species would do under a given pressure. They'd been doing it for hundreds of years, across dozens of species, and their models were refined and tested and reliable. What happened at Anvil 7 was the first documented case of a human doing something that broke the model entirely. Not because it was clever, not because it was tactically superior, because it was unexplainable through the model. And a species that can't be modeled is a species that can't be reliably opposed. The report's conclusion was careful about what it claimed. It wasn't saying humans were invincible. It wasn't saying one incident had changed everything. But it noted, with considerable interest, that Veth operational patterns in the 18 months following Anvil 7 showed a specific and measurable increase in hesitation on contact with small groups of human defenders, particularly in close-quarters situations. Not much hesitation, not decisive hesitation, but some. A fraction of a second, a calculation that took longer than it should have. And in combat, fractions of seconds matter. Chapter 12, what Des said. I talked to Harron a lot in the months after Anvil 7. He was on extended medical leave while his burns healed, and the doctors argued about the long-term effects of the suit seal failure on his pulmonary system. I was on administrative desk duty while the debrief process dragged on. We talked over drinks, usually in a small establishment near the Fleet Medical Center on New Carthage that we both independently adopted as a regular location without planning it. He didn't talk much about the hub corridor in those conversations. Not because he was avoiding it, it wasn't a trauma he was suppressing, or it didn't present that way. It was more that he'd said what there was to say in the debrief and in the follow-up xenopsychology sessions, and he didn't feel a particular need to repeat it. But there was one evening late, when the bar was quieter than usual, and the synthetic alcohol had done its soft work on both of us, when he said something I've thought about often since. He said, "The thing I keep coming back to is, I didn't do it for the story. I didn't do it to send a message to the Veth or to prove something about humanity or any of that. I did it because it was the only thing that felt like me in that moment. The bravest thing I've ever done had nothing to do with courage in the way people mean that word. It had to do with honesty. I was just being honest about what I was." I asked him what he meant. He thought about it, turned his drink in his hands. "There's a kind of freedom," he said. "That comes when you're not pretending you don't know what's happening. When you look at a thing clearly, exactly what it is, exactly what the odds are, and you don't look away from it, and you don't pretend it's different than it is, and you still take the next step. Not because you don't know the thing is there. Because you do know it's there and you've decided the step matters more." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the Veth have never met a species that does that, looks clearly at the impossible thing and then takes the step anyway without any calculation supporting it. They can read calculation. They can read desperation. They can read sacrifice as collective logic. They can't read whatever that is. The thing where you see clearly and you choose freely and you're not afraid of either the seeing or the choosing." He picked up his drink. "That's the thing about humans," he said. "That's the terrifying thing if you're something that's never seen it before. We can choose to not be afraid of the truth, and a species that can do that is ungovernable by the kind of pressure they've always used." Chapter 13, 18 months later. 18 months after Anvil 7, something happened that I wasn't expecting. I got a message, official through the fleet channels, from the Xenopsychology Research Division on New Carthage. They were compiling a broader study on human-Veth contact incidents and wanted my contribution. Specifically, they wanted the parts of my account that hadn't made it into the official records because they were subjective, personal, observational. They wanted the feel of it, which is what you're reading now, more or less, an expanded version of what I gave them. My attempt to put down not just the sequence of events, but the texture of them, what it felt like, what it smelled like in those corridors, what Heron's voice sounded like on the radio when he said he was alone in the hub. I wrote it because they asked, but I also wrote it because I think stories matter in ways that official records don't capture. The official records tell you what happened. Stories tell you what it means. Here's what I think it means. I've had 18 months to think about this, and this is where I've landed. The universe is very large. It is full, as far as we can tell, of species that have learned the same basic lessons about survival and power. Species that expand because expansion is survival. Species that assess threats through models built from historical data and project those models forward with confidence. Species that have been doing this long enough that their models are very, very good. And then there are humans. Humans who evolved in a very specific and in many ways very difficult environment, and who developed, in response to that environment, a particular capacity that seems to be rarer than we thought. The capacity to look directly at an impossible situation and respond to it with something that isn't calculation. Call it courage if you want. That word has been used. Call it freedom in the specific sense Heron used it. The freedom that comes from not being governed by the math of your own survival. Call it the thing that happens when a species' emotional and psychological development gets complicated enough that the relationship between seeing clearly and being afraid stops being automatic. When clarity and fear get uncoupled, so that you can know exactly how bad the thing is and still choose freely how to respond to it. Whatever you call it, the Veth hadn't seen it before. Maybe no one else out there had. Chapter 14, The Name. The incident got a name in the end. Not officially. Officially it was listed as Defensive Operation, Anvil 7 Station, Helios Belt, Stardate, classified. But in the networks where stories travel, in the fleet channels and the civilian communications, and the translated fragments of Veth operational chatter that intelligence occasionally managed to decode, it got called something else. The 8 seconds. Just that. The 8 seconds when 40 Veth soldiers in a hub corridor looked at a single damaged human corporal walking toward them and couldn't figure out what the calculation was. And somewhere in the Veth's intelligence networks, in whatever they told each other about the species they'd been trying to push back from the shipping lanes, there was a new term, a new entry in their threat assessment taxonomy. The translation was imperfect. The xenolinguists argued about it, but the rough consensus was that the new term meant something like humans when they have stopped calculating. A category they hadn't needed before. A category that apparently unsettled them. Epilogue: what remains. I still have the duty log I kept during those 4 days on Anvil 7. Everyone on that station kept something, some kind of record, some anchor to the habit of observation that military people develop as both a professional obligation and a survival mechanism. Mine is 27 pages, handwritten on whatever flat surfaces I could find in the dark, in the narrow service tunnels, with a stylus that kept losing charge. The handwriting is bad, especially toward the end, when the cold and the stress and the sustained lack of sleep had made my fine motor control approximate at best. Some of it is illegible even to me. But I kept it. I keep it now in the physical way in a sealed case in my quarters, not displayed, not framed, just there. The way things that matter are just there, present in your space, not requiring acknowledgement. Heron recovered fully. His lung function came back better than the initial prognosis suggested, and he returned to active service 8 months after Anvil 7. The last I heard, he was stationed on a deep space monitoring installation even further out than Anvil 7, which sounds like a punishment, but apparently was his specific request. He said the quiet helped him think. Yoon retired, he grew things. Plants on a small plot of land on one of New Meridian's agricultural rings. He sends occasional messages that are mostly about the plants and occasionally about other things, and I read every one of them carefully. Hendricks became an instructor. Combat psychology specifically, the thing that happens to people under extreme pressure and how to prepare for it, and the limits of what preparation can actually do. She is, by all accounts, extraordinary at it. She still cries at the end of movies. She told me once that she considers this a feature rather than a bug. Ray's lost the full use of his left arm, the burned one, the one he shouldn't have been moving on when he took the second hit. He was medically separated from the service and moved back to his home station. He builds things now, physical things, mechanical things, with his good arm and the adapted tools he's learned to use. He sent me a picture once of something he'd made. A small, detailed model of Station Anvil 7, precise in every architectural detail, about the size of a dinner plate. Hanging in his living room, he said. I don't have words for what that made me feel. The universe is very large, and humans are, by any objective measure, a small part of it. We've been out here for less than 100 years, which is nothing. We arrived late to a conversation that had been going on for a very long time, and we brought with us all the things that make us what we are. The brilliance and the stubbornness and the impossible emotional complexity and the specific kind of courage that isn't always courage in the traditional sense, but sometimes is just a person in a broken suit deciding that the step matters more than the odds. I think the universe wasn't ready for that. I think, if I'm being honest, if I'm being the kind of clear-eyed about the big picture that Heron was about the small one, the universe didn't know what to do with a species that can be afraid and choose anyway, that can see clearly and still walk forward, that can stand in the corridor alone with 40 weapons pointed at them and find, in that moment, not a performance of bravery but a genuine quiet. The Veth feared the name of humanity after Anvil 7. Not because we won the battle, not because we were stronger or better armed or more strategically sophisticated. Because we produced, in the worst moment, a person who looked the worst moment in the face and did not look away and was not destroyed by what he saw. And if one human could do that, in one broken suit, in one corridor, in 8 seconds, what might all of us be capable of? That's the question the Veth started asking. That's the question I think about still. That's the question that is worth everything.